Hello, everyone. Welcome back to episode 2. For today, we're going to be talking about why men and mental health should be in the same sentence. But before we dive in, I do want to start with a few things like having to prepare for a YouTube video is much more challenging than I thought, yet at the same time rewarding. So it took some time for me to gather all that I need in order for this episode to flow in the way that I would like it to flow. So today we're going to be talking about men, and we're also going to be talking about mental health. And then we're going to combine those two together to then dive into some things that are necessary. The purpose of this episode is allow a space to raise awareness of common themes that I've experienced working with males, and many of you know I am a therapist. At the same time, experiences that I've endured personally in my life, whether it's through dating or through family, and just kind of like my perception of common themes that exist within the men community, if you will. So, I want to first start with what is mental health because I feel like I need to talk about this because we don't talk about this enough in general, and I feel as though that there is still such a powerful taboo and or stigma within the men community, and it's one of those things where I want to address a little bit about what mental health is. So, what is mental health? And I'm going to be looking down on my phone for reference purposes, and I'm taking all of this data from the CDC. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. I feel like we talk more about physical health in general more than we do mental health. I know from my experiences that, as a Caribbean woman, I wasn't introduced to mental health until I moved to Connecticut. However, I grew up being very much aware of physical illnesses like diabetes or hypertension or high blood pressure, right? Or sugar, if you will, right? So it's one of those things where, like, even for myself, and I'm a victim of this, where physical health was much more prominent or more normal conversation, that there weren't much conversation about mental health. And that is why I ended up pursuing this field in general, because I recognize the gift that it has given me, but also like recognizing that I also had my own stigmas, and how to challenge those stigmas requires education and awareness. And so that is part of the reason why we're having this conversation today. We are going to be raising awareness. So let's continue. So why is mental health important for overall health? Mental and physical health are equally important components of overall health. For example, depression increases the risk for many types of physical health problems, such as diabetes and heart disease, right? Similarly, the presence of chronic conditions, right, the reverse, can increase the risk of mental illnesses, right? But we're not going to talk much about mental illness today. I am sharing the awareness of mental health in general. So, how many of us, right, you're going to be tuning into this, how many of us didn't realize how important mental health was? And just some reflection questions. When did you discover mental health? And what does that mean to you? Who helped you discover it, if there was someone, or did you have to discover it on your own? So let's talk about how common mental illnesses are. This is taken from the CDC, and these are just some facts that we need to know. So, more than 1 in 5 US adults live with a mental illness. Over 1 in 5 youth, very important, ages 13 to 18, either currently or at some point during their life, have had a seriously debilitating mental. I want to pause here because I just shared a whole lot, but I want to specifically highlight how when a person is not introduced to mental health early on, it unintentionally transfers into adulthood. So if you're not in an environment where people are talking about mental health, feeling sad, feeling anxious, feeling nervous, and just kind of becoming aware of emotions, then when you are an adult, there is a chance that you may struggle with recognizing how you're feeling within your own body, your own mind. And so with that, it leads to having difficulty articulating how you're feeling because of the absence of this skill being implemented throughout your childhood. And we're going to talk about emotional intelligence because that's an area that I want to touch on. And so I'm going to stop here for now. I want to talk about some questions that I thought would be important for men in particular. Women, as you're tapping in, definitely feel free to reflect on your own experiences, right? And just kind of replacing the gender with yourself or even women. This is for the men, and I want to not take away from the fact that women's mental health isn't important because it is. However, we don't talk about men and mental health in the same sentence enough. And I want to tap into an experience that I had as an intensive outpatient therapist with about 35 men and just kind of like common themes that were identified. But first, let's start with the reflection questions. I wrote them down. And so just really take the opportunity to pause, and I'm going to pause directly after these questions just so that we can digest it, right? Okay, so growing up, who taught you what it means to be a boy, then a man? Following question. Thinking about those experiences, right? As far back as you could remember, what was instilled in you? If you were to describe what was taught, what would you say to a friend? What would you say to your partner then? And for those who don't know what partner then means, I'm from the Caribbean, specifically St. Croix. So there will be times where like my accent would be rearing its head. At the same time, the goal um, would be to grasp the information, right? So like in the comments, like feel free to ask what I said and what does that mean? Okay. So what was instilled in you? Was it being hardworking? Was it being a provider? Was it being a father? Was it, more so areas surrounded by, what it means to be masculine? And then the last question that I have is who taught you about emotional intelligence? And think about that for a second. Who taught you about emotional intelligence? Did someone teach you? And when did you learn? And these are just probing questions that are within that question. Did you learn independently later on as an adult, or did someone prepare you early on into um, your childhood? I want to touch base on what emotional intelligence is. And this is taken from Very Well Mind. And I'm going to read the entire thing because this is important. And there's some areas that I want to dive into. So what is emotional intelligence? Emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive, interpret, demonstrate, control, evaluate, and use emotions to communicate with and relate to others effectively and constructively. I want to highlight some keywords, and those are to perceive, to interpret, to demonstrate, take action, to control, to evaluate and use emotions to communicate with and relate to others effectively and constructively. Going back to the last question about, who taught you about emotional intelligence, really think about the key concepts within this definition and reflect on if they were addressed, and at what point were they addressed, and who addressed them. And don't exclude yourself from this, because you may have very well be that person who were able to uh, gain insight or awareness into this because maybe of an experience, and so you weren't able to exactly learn it during childhood. The other part is this ability to express and control emotions is essential, but so is the ability to understand, interpret, and respond to the emotions of others. What are signs of emotional intelligence? I feel like we need to get into the specifics, right? I encourage you to reflect, okay? So, some key signs, right? Doesn't mean it's all, but just some key signs, right? It includes an ability to identify and describe what people are feeling, an awareness of personal strengths and limitations, self confidence and self acceptance. Do not mix up self confidence with being cocky or narcissistic. Very, very different. The ability to let go of mistakes. And I want to highlight here, even though this is directly taken from Very Well Mine, in this area, for me, it's the word, right? Language matters for me, and I'm very sensitive to language. So, like, let go of mistakes. It's not saying that you're going to forget, but rather you're going to give yourself the grace and recognizing that you're human and that you are going to make mistakes. It's just a part of the experience. Others, an ability to accept and embrace change, right? A strong sense of curiosity, particularly about other people, asking questions, the necessary questions, feelings of empathy and concern for others, showing sensitivity to the feelings of other people. So, acknowledging that, like, people may feel differently from you, and it's being okay with that, right? Accepting responsibility for mistakes, the ability to manage emotions in difficult situations. That one is a good one, which leads me to my experiences as an IOP clinician. So, I had decided that I wanted to do something about these feelings that I had. Like, why am I holding back, like, barriers that are internal that wouldn't allow me to accept and appreciate a person, right? And also, like, recognizing that ties in the biases that I carry: cultural, internal, familial, community, economical. I mean, you name it. Every single bias, is something that I carried, and I wanted to challenge them in a way that is going to be profound and positively impactful. And so I pursued this field with the goal of just challenging myself where in areas that I need more education about, but also recognizing that I wanted to use the opportunity of education to then share this information with others, such as in spaces like this. Let's talk about my experiences working as an intensive outpatient therapist. So, first of all, going back to biases. Growing up in my culture, I remember there was stigma around people who were unhoused, who struggled with a variety of psychotic disorders, and not just psychotic, but just general mental health challenges, and specifically those who struggle with substance use. There was significant stigma, and so I carry these stigmas with me. And I want to definitely talk about, like, biases for a second before I dive in. Biases are really perceptions and attitudes that we have towards people, and it can go further, right? And it is not limited to people, but it really creates a barrier in so many different ways, and it's really diverse, to then not be able to, if it's so ingrained, right? uh it can be unconscious, it can be subconscious, and it can also be conscious. And so you may find, AKA, that you may be carrying biases that you are aware of, and then there may be some biases that you may not be aware of. The question is, where did you learn those biases? And who taught you? And I feel personally that we're all products of our environment, and we're all members of communities, that we have to really examine those areas in our lives where we grew up in, to essentially gain insight into, like, where did our biases come from, our values, not just biases, but our way of life, and how we view people, how we view ourselves, how we interact with other people, how we interact with ourselves, and what we do, the actions that we take, the decisions that we make. So essentially, it's really thinking about those things and just tying it in a nutshell, as far as recognizing our biases. So, fast forward, I became an IOP clinician. Never thought ever that I would be working in this population. I remember when I was a student, they asked us to think about, like, populations that we want to work with, and that was the last one that I was thinking about working with, because of the biases that I had, the cultural stuff, right? The attitudes. And I thought, okay, I graduated, right? And I had to decide where I wanted to work. And, like, for my counseling friends out there, like, like, it's one of those things where, like, our fields are so broad, and it is, right? It's so broad that we can decide which population that we want to work with, because it's such a diverse um, outlet, right? So I remember feeling fearful of, like, working with individuals who were struggling with substance use because of the biases that I carried. And again, I'm big on challenging, because I feel like areas that I find that is challenging for me, there's an area that I need to explore, and I need to do something about it, right? So I decided to apply to this IOP clinician role. And I remember, like, one of the clinicians that I was working with, um, essentially, he was just like, you got it, and I was like, but do I? Because I was so consumed with my fear that I never thought that it would have become the amazing and remarkable experience that it did end up becoming. So I ended up working with about 35 men, and it was the most beautiful experience that I've ever had in my entire life. I can't stop sharing, you know, um, this story, because it was such a profound memory for me that it changed the trajectory of the way that I view people who are struggling with substance use, but also, like, the language used within that community. And I just actively intend on challenging every single one of them, especially if it's insensitive. Um, and it's one of those things where, like, I've learned that we all have an addiction in some way. It's just that within this population, it's different, right? And it can be much more severe and detrimental, but it doesn't mean that other addictions cannot be. But back to the story, I can definitely become tangential. But back to the story. So, working as an IOP clinician taught me that, one, men struggle more in terms of acknowledging their own emotions, because there was this common theme that I discovered, that society created, and not just society, but again, our communities, right? Our families, right? Our environments created this uh, unwritten rule about men and women and gender overall, that it it then translated into, struggling with mental illnesses, but also, like, embracing the mental health in general. The unfortunate challenges that I observed was that not only was there struggles with, general mental health stuff, but there was a unique struggle with emotional intelligence. And for me, it was not just emotional awareness, but also emotional articulation, emotional validation, and not just for others, but for oneself, right? So when I would bring up areas that would maybe be painful or sad, it's immediately uh, discarded. And personally, because of this work that I've been doing for the last several years, I've recognized that there is a deeper understanding that is required, especially when connecting with people. And the struggle with recognizing the lack of emotional intelligence stemmed from so many different things. And I remember talking to one of my clients, and for the purposes of like confidentiality and privacy, I'm not going to share his name, but I want to share the story. And here it goes. So there was a client in particular who shared, this was group work that we were doing. Um, and so there was a client who was very vocal with his experiences growing up as a male. And this story really resonated with me, and it still resonates with me up until this day. And I remember like asking the group, tell me about your experiences with being a male, right? And this particular person, he shared insight into when he was growing up. He remembered that his father had an issue with him crying, and he's talking about like when he was 7, his father like telling him to toughen up, like men don't cry, and he's weak, right? And he remembered like getting into a relationship with a woman who also said the same thing to him. He was weak for crying, man up, and all of these emotionally invalidating responses that would then encourage a person to stay in their shell and stay in their shell for as long as it means to be protected by from the world, right? So he remembered starting as early as 7, his father sharing this with him. So what did that tell him? And these are like this was a conversation that we had, and like other men started like adding in their experiences because he had validated most of the men there. I would say almost all of the men there, that it was a shared experience for most of the men there, that the male figures and even women figures growing up crushed their ability to be emotional. There was no opportunities to cry. Crying was associated with being a woman. There was just so much harm in that. However, right, growing up, you're like, well, these are my parents, right? Like I would trust like what they're saying to me. So obviously they're right, right? Like, and that's so common for many of us, right? Because these are leaders in our household, so we're gonna respect them, we're gonna honor them, we're gonna make sure that we pay our loyalties to them, right? So we're like, yeah, like for sure. And and it's one of those things where like, it takes growing up to then essentially tap into who you are as a person, because now you're not going to be depending on your parents or caregivers to share things with you as much as you would as if you were 5, right? Because now you're like 30, right? Different dependence here. And I remembered, us talking about it, and he shared like, at the time it was so normal. It was so normal for him to not cry. There were like some kids who were bullying him at school, and he was like coming home angry, just angry. By the way, that is a form of depression as well, right? And what I mean is that in men, aggression or anger, often is displayed because there's so much to uncover there. It's not just anger, and it could very well be anger. However, at times where there is pain, it's not just anger, it's sadness, it's disappointment, it's embarrassment, It's judgment, feeling judged, there's shame, there's guilt. I mean, you name it, right? And so at the time, he had gone through so many different things uh as a child, and continuing on into adolescenthood and teenagehood. He remembered, like, he coming home and then his parents would be upset because he would um be aggressive towards them. Like, he wouldn't express how he was feeling, right? He knew that this thing happened, it upset him, and really he felt like the only emotion that he could turn to was anger. And it's one of those things where, like, it was so normalized to calm down the anger, that it became an emotion that stayed with him for a long time. So when he's feeling something that is intense, that is painful, that he would then, you know, show anger instead of how he really feels. And he remembered, like, in his mind, his father, and even when his father passed away, his father was in the back of his mind saying, crying is for weak men. You're not a man, and just kind of like beating him down, not allowing him to truly discover the emotional intelligence piece that he so desired. And he remembered feeling like that there was a desire to cry, but yet there was voices that was telling him not to. And then he got into this relationship, and then here he is, and this was his first relationship, right? And the woman is saying the same thing to him, and he was like, obviously, like, this is the best way to do this because this is something that I grew up learning. How many of us can relate to that? That's the reason why I'm sharing this story. How many things that were normalized in our communities that became so normalized that they were not an opportunity to invite something that's new, to invite something that's different, right? And so I remembered, like, the other men started saying, like, very similar experiences where the caregivers, or like their grandfathers, because I remember, like, a few of them had resonated with, like, older people in their lives sharing what it means to be a man, working hard, making bread, making sure you have a relationship, starting a family. All of these things were taught and ingrained, that the only thing that was missing was emotional intelligence. And to me, that was an absolute disservice. And so when I connect with men, and I mean, like, professionally and personally, and I think about, like, what I am looking for, you know let me start with professional. So, when it comes down to, looking for areas that, would be beneficial in treatment, I look at that area, right? Because, like, we can talk about contributions to depression and anxiety. However, how are you expressing yourself? How are you acknowledging your emotions in a genuine way that is going to be rewarding for your soul? How are you able to then, how are you expressing yourself to me? Right? And also, when I share feedback as far as validating your emotions, how do you receive that? Right? And so it's one of those things where, like, I look for that, because, and then my approach to therapy is very different. Let's talk about your childhood, and also let's talk about, like, how does that then, your childhood, right? How does that then tie into your perception of therapy, for example? Right? That I am a female therapist, right? And so calling out the things that, would be like the obvious in the room, and like having, like, maybe, like, areas of a moments of exploration to then dive into the deeper stuff, right? Then tying in, like, contributions to depression, right? Because I look at the whole person, right? You didn't just arrive here, right? You were born and someone raised you, and now you're here, right? Now you're an adult. Now you're, like, dealing with stuff, right? Stress, for example. That's another area, right? So, like, who taught you how to manage stress, right? What did you see? Who did you look up to? Right? And then also, how does that translate to, like, your personal experiences with stress management, right? Where are you mirroring areas of your life growing up, right? Or even now, right? Because we still have models in our lives as adults, right? So, like, who are you mirroring when it comes to stress management? And did you learn from someone, and or did you had to develop those skills on your own? And so tying in the personal aspect of my life, I'm a person who is emotional intelligent, right? And like people would say all the time, like, oh, well, because you're a therapist. Well, yes. And also, becoming a therapist changed my trajectory again. It expanded my knowledge, it expanded my skills, and it expanded my curiosity. Now, here's the thing, right? Though emotions were, for me, right? Though emotions were expressed, they were not verbalized. So I've seen anger, right, growing up. I've seen sadness. I've seen anxiety. I never heard it. I never heard the terms. Never heard the terms. How many of you here have experienced that? I remember like looking at, you know, uh, a variety of mental health challenges, right? And I was like, I felt this. I felt sadness. Why, why am I now learning about the language around mental health, right? About challenges that people go through that are pretty common and okay to go through. Why am I now discovering this in my adulthood? Because I did not discover the true meaning of mental health and mental illnesses until I moved to Connecticut as an adult. Which again, we have to talk about that. Going back to my personal experience. So, when I'm dating, these are things that I look out for. I'm not an expert on dating. I mean, there isn't really no manual to date anyway. However, these are things that I look out for, right? So, how does this man um, uh, approach me, right? How does he support me when I'm not feeling my best, right? How does he support me when I am feeling my best, right? Because it's not just sadness, it's happiness too. How does he support me in every arena when it comes to my emotions? Emotions matter, right? And it's one of those things where like they're cues, right? They're cues. And so like how does he manage them? And also like when I'm expressing myself to him, how does he receive that? Right? Is it shut down? Is it dismissed? Is it laughed at? Right? Like all of these things that I look out for because that is very important to be able to acknowledge me in that way. Growing up, emotional intelligence was not something that was exactly discussed within my family. You see the emotions, you don't hear about it, right? And this goes for the men and the women as well. I wasn't exposed to a man saying, I'm feeling sad because I had a rough day, right? Here is what my day entailed. It was nothing. It was nothing. And it's one of those things where, like, when now with the awareness that I have now and the education that I have now, I recognize that for me, dating, I'm intentional about it, and emotional intelligence is required. You know what I mean? However, what does that mean for people who may struggle? And I see that, right? That might be a question that someone may ask me in the comments. And what does that mean as far as meeting someone who is struggling with emotional intelligence? I would say that I would give them grace because in my mind, and again, this goes back to this deeper understanding that I've gained through this experience of being a therapist, an educator. Um, it's one of those things where like I would I'm the kind of person who would acknowledge it. I would say, hey, like, I shared this very important thing and I didn't get feedback. And I would attempt to communicate this, right? Now, when I communicate this, right, I look for how you respond. When it comes to confrontation, it can be intimidating for some people. And I remember in my life, it once was. At the same time, sometimes confrontation is is necessary. And again, for me, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, how you approach this person, right? Thinking about, for me at least, if you were that person, how would you receive that? And so like being conscientious of wording, right? And tone, right? Delivery, all that. So, like for me, for a person who may be not demonstrating emotional intelligence, I would approach them with like the thing that I want to talk about. And then, like, depending on how the person responds, I can either do two things. Now, if the person responds with like acknowledging that, and then like we talk about it, we're communicating, I love that. Now, if the person then responds with, okay, um, well, that's how you feel, right? Like bland, no regard, then I will communicate. And I believe in communication. That's very important. I would then communicate to this person, okay, well, you know what, this is what I'm looking for. And, maybe at this time you're not in a space of providing this, and that's okay. Right. It doesn't mean that I'm not hurt by it because I'm like, like when you're dating somebody intentionally, you'd want for the thing to work out. However, it's also recognizing that not everyone is for you and you're not for everybody. And so how do you manage that? Right. It's being okay with something that is maybe painful to process, yet also recognizing that I would rather gain insight into this now versus later. And we're like 10 years in and I'm still struggling with this. Right. And so, it's one of those things where, like, for me personally, one, emotional intelligence is something that is important to me in general. I mean, like, within family dynamics and friendship dynamics, and also recognizing that there are people who struggle with this, right? Like myself, and I shared my story. I wasn't introduced to emotional intelligence in a way that I know what it is now and how I share it and I express it, and I provide the skills, with my clients and even family and friends who are open to embracing it, but also recognizing that that emotional intelligence is something that is um it's practice, and this is a skill that I teach, and it's one of those things where, like, it is possible for it to be taught to people who are willing and open to learn it, right? And so, like, um tying all of what was shared, right, is recognizing that if you're a male and after this clip this resonates with you and you're like, I need to think about this. I want to first offer grace, right? Because we're learning beings as human beings. And if you feel as though you've had similar experiences like my client, who, grew up with voices that deterred him from expressing his emotions in a healthy way, right? In an effective way, it's recognizing that, there is hope for you. So give yourself the grace, because you deserve to become aware of how you're feeling. You deserve to feel how you're feeling. You deserve for someone else to acknowledge how you're feeling, and so on. Here's the thing: you're doing a disservice to yourself if there is an ongoing pattern of not validating your emotions. Especially if you already spent years doing that already. You're doing a disservice to yourself, and chances are you're doing a disservice to others, like people who you're dating, right? So, people who struggle with recognizing their own stuff, it can be difficult for them to recognize or even address the things that may be going on for the other person. And so, it's so important to tap into that emotional side of you. You don't deserve to be maybe consumed by anger. You don't deserve to be burdened by not not acknowledging your own feelings or validating your own feelings, or even expressing it, right? And communicating it, right? And it's also recognizing that if you're in spaces where you are not being validated, or you're not feeling like you could emotionally express yourself as a man, examine it. A lot of us need to examine our circles. It's so important to do that, because who else is going to do it for us, right? And men, I'm speaking to you, right? It's not just about, hanging out and spending quality time and doing all of these things that are the physical. It's also the emotional. You need to be around people who's going to support you when you're down, and it's not going to tell you toughen up or man up or you're weak or like you're crying is for this, and no, you don't deserve that. You deserve a circle of people, including the person that you're dating, to allow you to just be human, because having emotions is being human. There's no such thing as, and I feel like there's such a stigma too, like, males are not as emotional as women. Who came up with that? Who came up with that, for real? You know what I'm saying? Like, why are we creating more barriers, like, for men to not be able to express themselves, right? it's time to challenge those stigma areas, right? Those biases, those perceptions, the attitudes, the language around emotions, especially within the men community. We need men who feel comfortable with expressing themselves and knowing that it's okay, but it's also learning your environment and making sure that you trust your environment, that you feel safe and secure in this environment to then express yourself, right? And so that takes examination. So I wanna leave with this, right? There is a diagram that talks about the key concepts of emotional intelligence, and it is self-awareness, empathy, motivation, self-regulation, social skills. I want to go back to self-awareness though. The more aware you are about your emotions, the more you're likely to then express your emotions to then do something about it. So if you're feeling angry about a situation, right? It's one, processing, right? What are your contributions? Like what is contributing to that anger, right? And is it really anger or is it some other feelings associated with it? And then now, finding someone that you can express that with because you don't deserve to bottle that up inside at all, right? You're human. Find someone that you can rely on emotionally, that you trust, that you feel safe with, that would respond to you, that will provide warmth and responses, and just kind of cater to you in that way and be vulnerable with you, right? As you share sensitive information. Um, then, after you express that, see if maybe you can do something about it. So, what do I mean by that? Maybe finding something that would take your mind off of it, right? So whether it may be going for a walk, right? Or maybe like watching TV, right? Something that is enjoyable. And I will also, share that you can maybe do something fun, indulge in some self-care, and just kind of allow the space for you to take action about the way that you're feeling. Do not take how you feel out on other people, especially if it doesn't have anything to do with that. Very important. If there's something that you feel heavy about and you maybe not in the right space to talk, give yourself the time to process how you're feeling. And this all ties back to emotional intelligence. And give yourself the time to process how you're feeling and then be able to articulate that. It's one of those things where, like, when you're carrying a backpack, and I always use this analogy, and I switch it up at times depending on what comes to mind first, but I want to use the analogy of a backpack because I like that one for this purpose. You're carrying a backpack, right? And it's empty. And Monday something happens, you're sad about it, you put it in the backpack. Imagine the backpack being your body, right? And so you put it in the backpack. That happened on Monday. Another situation happened on Tuesday. Then there's Thursday. Then there's Saturday. And you just keep packing it in this backpack, right? Your body, right? And you haven't told anybody, right? So you're experiencing a variety of emotions all at once, but no one knows. And there's a barrier there that is preventing you from doing so, right? Why is there a barrier, right? Thinking about that. And also, like, do you deserve to carry this heavy backpack? You don't. You don't have to share everything with everybody, but my encouragement is to find someone that you can share something with, especially things that are heavy. I don't want to, like, take away from, emotional intelligence also meaning when you experience like happiness too, because that's important, right? Same thing applies though, right? What is contributing to my happiness? Right? And can I do something to add to this happiness? Right? Can I take action? So vice versa. Um, you will see that I spend a lot of time talking about like sadness, and I do not call emotions negative or positive. I call them emotions. You see that I spend a lot of time talking about sadness and anger because I feel like that those are uh normalized emotions within the men community, and that is unfair. And what I mean by that is, like, men are just not angry, right? And I feel that's so common, especially for my black and brown men, right? Um, you're not just angry, you're not an angry person, right? No one is just born angry. That's not a thing. right? It's also thinking about too, if you do feel like you're an angry person and angry all the time, is exploring that and connecting with a professional who can support you through that. And until then, connecting with the people in your group whom you feel safe with, right? Or a person whom you feel safe with. It doesn't have to be everybody, just one person, all it takes. You have to realize that you're human. As cliche as that sounds, and I may sound like a broken record, you're human. Men, you're human. And I'm an advocate for men. I'm an advocate for being a human being, no matter the gender. You know what I mean? And I feel like and that many of us should show up this way because we should be in thriving environments where our people feel like they could just exist, that they don't have to put up this front or put on this mask and pretend. You don't deserve to be in spaces where you feel like you just can't rest. You have to be working all the time. You know what I mean? You have to be a provider all the time. That's just a part of it. If you are already those things, that isn't entirely who you are. Isn't entirely who you are. And there was a note that I wanted to address while we were here together, and it was particularly connected to men. Um, and I felt the need to share this. This is taken from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. And it says, although mental illnesses are more prevalent in women than in men, as if we don't already have stuff going on already, women, right? Like, aren't we tired? Men suffering from mental illnesses are less likely to receive mental health treatment or diagnoses. There are many reasons for this, and one of them is the pressure men face to man up or tough it out, right? Remember my client, okay? The stigma of men speaking out is that it is seen as a form of weakness or not manly, right? Where did that come from? Right? Who created that? Men feeling depression and anxiety or any other mental illness is not unusual, because it's not, and is nothing to feel ashamed of. Other reasons that may impact a man's mental health journey are culture, fatherhood, race, and socioeconomic status. And so I want to hone in on that briefly. So for me, and my experiences is recognizing that, if you're coming from a socioeconomic status that is low or poverty level, you may not have access to one, mental health, right? And so what does that mean? Insurance to receive support, right? And that goes for parents too, right? And so if you were born in this environment where there isn't much access, there isn't much resources, how could you gain insight into the things that are necessary, like emotional intelligence? Okay. Continuing on, these stigmas are real, they're real, and deeply affect men, as nearly 1 in 10 men experience depression or anxiety. Less than half will receive treatment, and more than 4 times as many men as women die by suicide every year. That is a cry for help. Men, the purpose of this video is to raise awareness. This is why I do what I do, and this is why I advocate for men, because men, you deserve to be here, and men, you deserve to exist. You deserve to be here. You don't deserve to suffer in silence. You don't. Okay? Symptoms of mental illness differ in men from women, right? And we talked about like aggression and anger being seen as depressive symptoms, right? Recognizing the signs that you or someone you love may have a mental health challenge is the first step towards getting the right help and treatment. The earlier someone receives treatment, the more effective it can be. Symptoms of mental health challenges in men that we don't talk about enough. It's important to acknowledge that when depression occurs in men, it may be masked by unhealthy coping behaviors. So things that are harmful, right? So what does this look like? Escapist behaviors, such as spending a lot of time at work or on sports. Physical symptoms, such as getting headaches, digestive issues, or pain. Misuse of alcohol and or substances, right? Controlling, violent, and or abusive behaviors. We talked about this. Anger, right? Irritability or aggressiveness. inappropriate anger. Yes, there is a such thing. And it doesn't take away or the goal isn't to invalidate anyone who's experiencing anger. It's also exploring the intensity of it. What does that look like, right? Are you causing harm to yourself, harm to others, or harm to the environment? Okay. Risky behaviors such as reckless driving, right? Noticeable changes in mood, energy level, or appetite. Difficulty concentrating, feeling restless, or on edge, right? So these are common experiences within the men community. But I want to talk about experiences of depression and anxiety. So it can look like feeling sad, hopeless, or empty, feeling extremely tired, having difficulty sleeping or sleeping too much, right? Um, not getting pleasure from activities usually enjoyed, and or suicidal thoughts. I encourage you to, if you know of anyone who's there, right? Please, please, please seek support. Okay, you can always call 911. Always call 911. And or your local hospital or behavioral health service. And I say that from my heart. You deserve to be here, man. You deserve to be your best self, to be your authentic self, to challenge the stigmas and biases that were placed upon you that you didn't ask for. Okay? And I want to highlight this. Over 6 million men suffer from depression per year, but male depression often goes underdiagnosed. You hear that? You hear that? What is a contributing factor to that? And why aren't more men feeling comfortable with just being able to feel emotions, right? And express them? You deserve love, and you deserve to be around people who support you in every single way. Not just because you're a father, but because you're human. Not because you're, but because you're human. Not because of all the roles and statuses that you have or all the money that you have in the world. Because you're human. Because you're human. You deserve people who are going to support you in your humanness in every capacity. So this will conclude the ending of my episode today. And this is why men and mental health deserves to be in the same sentence, because it's not it's not something that we often talk about. And I'm not with breaking down men. Men doesn't deserve to receive that either. Men does not deserve to be broken down even further, even deeper. I mean, how much more? You're human at the ending of the day. And you deserve to live and to breathe and to feel like you can feel things, right? And share them in safe spaces, right? And so this is what I will leave with you. This is why I dedicated this video strictly to you. Not just because November is Mental Health Awareness Month, but because your mental health matters all of the time, every single day. And it's not limited to a month. And we don't talk about this enough. Men, you deserve to thrive, not just survive. And you deserve to feel your emotions, to express them, and for people to receive you as well, and to understand you as well, validate you as you validate yourself. I love you. Stay tuned for more. And I look forward to episode 3. Feel free to leave your thoughts below. And if you haven't been following me, that's okay. Find me at Bloom Speaking of Sunflower blog on both Instagram and Facebook. And feel free to DM me.